Welcome to Threads of Truth, where we explore the mysterious and paranormal stories from around the world. Today we delve into the chilling legends of the Wendigo, a creature shrouded in darkness and fear. Join us as we unravel the truth behind the tales of this terrifying being. Are you brave enough to join us on this journey into the unknown? Let's begin. This is still hard for me to wrap my head around because it shook me to my core, but this story takes place just over a year ago in late November 2018. I live in a rural suburb in Wisconsin near a line of woods and ponds. My town is small and everything is silent and dark by 9 p.m. I tend to walk my dog after dinner and before bed, and my town is pretty safe, so walking her in the dark never fazed me. I live in an apartment complex that is on the end of a residential street, so most of the street is older houses. One night I was walking my dog, around 10:30 p.m. I think, when I saw something on the front lawn of one of these houses. They didn't have a light on their front porch, so most of their lawn was dark, but with lights from the surrounding houses I could see a figure standing in the middle of their lawn. It was very tall and skinny, almost as tall as the roof of their ranch house, because even standing in the middle of the front yard it looked almost as tall as the house. It was standing on its hind legs but had antlers or some type of tall ears like a bunny, and its arms and legs were abnormally long and stretched to the bone. The moment I saw it my body froze, and I had that feeling that you only get when you're near immediate danger or evil. For context, I love the supernatural, paranormal, and true crime. I've lived in a without a doubt haunted house, frequently go on after-hours explorations of known haunted places, and have seen and experienced many paranormal events. That feeling is undeniable once you are familiar with it. So this tall, lanky creature is standing there, and I can't see its face, but by its positioning I know it has noticed me, also. My dog, who is normally aware of every living creature from a mile away in a snowstorm, is completely unaware of its presence. It felt like longer, but it was only a few seconds before this creature jumped straight up in the air, and I mean straight up, not forward, and bounded to the back of the house in 3 large strides. It didn't make a sound, and the way it jumped and moved was unlike any animal I've ever seen. The closest I would akin it to would be a deer, but it was on its hind legs and had the body features of a stretched out human but with antlers or tall ears. I felt stuck and almost hypnotized by the whole thing, but came to my senses enough to call attention to my dog and turn around to head for home. Behind all of the houses on this side of the street is woods, and some of the trees wrap around between this house and the neighboring house coming back towards home. We turned around, my eyes glued to the trees, and when we got to the middle of the houses I could see 2 eyes watching me through the 2 houses. The presence and overall weight of the feeling this whole encounter gave me still sticks with me as clearly as the night it happened. I can remember it all so vividly and still feel the weight. Ever since that night I've been thinking about it and running through all of the possibilities of what it could be, but always coming up with no explanation. It wasn't until about a month ago that I was watching a special on supernatural encounters that I heard about Wendigos. The description fit perfectly and made my blood run even colder. I'm fully convinced that what I saw that night had to have been a Wendigo. I've made a point to only walk my dog during the daylight during the summer months, and on the connecting street that is the main road of my town that is at least lit with streetlights in the winter when it gets dark before I'm even home from work. Since that night I haven't had any other direct encounter with it, except one event that I'm not sure is related but elicited that same feeling of being watched. It happened a few weeks ago when my brother was over. He was outside smoking when he came in quickly and locked the door behind him. I had mentioned my encounter to him when it first happened, but he shrugged it off like most people I told, and likely didn't give it a second thought. He looked shaken and kept looking through the peephole in my door and not saying anything. He finally got out that he was outside smoking and heard loud dragging and rustling sounds coming from the wooded pond area. He said he was listening for about a minute and thought he caught a glimpse of something very tall near the tree line. He described it as the sound it would make if someone were dragging a heavy animal or body through rough brush/woods, and he had a feeling of dread and heaviness, like he couldn't look away and was being honed in on by something. Normally I'm the type of person that would go out and look for myself, maybe even going down by the pond to explore and find something, but this case shuts all of that down. There is something viscerally evil about this creature that not even I care to explore further. I've tried telling people in my life about all of this, but, as most people do with this type of stuff, none of them really put any stock into it except my brother now that he's had this experience. I'm of the mind that things beyond our comprehension and everyday scope absolutely do exist, and this is one I won't be messing with or going on adventures to see again. Legends and beliefs exist for a reason, and this is one I don't want to mess with. So, Wendigo in my neighborhood, let's not meet. I realize how unbelievable this story might be, but I assure you it's entirely true. I've had countless experiences with the supernatural since I was 4, I'm 33 now, but this is one of the most terrifying ones I've had. I've looked at some of the stories in this community to see if there's anything I haven't discovered yet. I thought that if I shared my encounter here, there might be someone who has some information that could help. Please don't comment if you don't believe in the supernatural. I've seen skeptics plastering their 2 cents on some posts. I'm looking for legitimate information. My questions are at the end of this. Thanks in advance. I had an experience with a Wendigo this fall in early October in northern Minnesota in a state forest, very close to, if not on, a reservation. I've always heard that speaking of them can draw them to you, but I hadn't thought of or listened to any Wendigo stories any time close to my encounter. I was staying with some very dear friends, I'll call them Maria and Christopher. They have a camper in their yard by the lake for guests to sleep in. I had walked down to the camper from the house with my miniature dachshund, Ebony. It was around midnight and I found that I needed to set some things up, primarily the heater. By the time I was done getting everything in order, it was approximately 1:30 a.m. and I never thought to lock the door because, really, I figured it's in the middle of the woods so there was nothing to worry about. But I was wrong. I had closed the curtains, thank God, and I was having trouble falling asleep because my anxiety was going mad. Maria and Christopher's dogs were barking outside, and their geese wouldn't stop honking. Ebony, who usually sleeps under the covers, was sitting on my hip while I laid on my side, and I could feel her turning her head back and forth, like she was trying to track something outside. I tried tucking her under the blankets to calm her down, but she kept returning to her perch on my hip. I have no idea how long I laid there, I would say at least 40 minutes, when all of a sudden I heard Maria's voice outside the camper, "Anybody in there?" And what sounded like claws dragged down the side of the camper. I almost called back to her, when I realized number 1, she and Chris were both fast asleep by now, and number 2, Maria knew I was in there, she wouldn't ask if anybody was. Suddenly, I noticed everything had gone absolutely silent outside. The dogs and the birds had stopped carrying on, the gusts of wind had even stopped. It was the kind of silence you hear about in horror stories, how the woods go mute when something evil is in the area. Then another thought hit me, Ebony would be losing her SHT and barking at the door if that had been anything human. She was frozen on my hip, dead quiet, shaking. I didn't dare to move, but I was really starting to have to pee. And I remembered that I hadn't locked the door. I have no idea how long I laid there debating whether I should get up and use the bathroom and lock the door, but it felt like an eternity. In reality, I guessed it was maybe 10 to 15 minutes. I thought it may have been a skinwalker at first, but remembered they don't mimic the voices of your loved ones to lure you into the woods. Wendigo do. I knew these creatures, demons, whatever they are, can lure humans out of their abodes if they make eye contact with you, and everything in me was screaming to make sure I didn't look outside as I walked softly to the front of the camper, and very slowly turned the lock, praying and holding my breath. I made sure to keep my eyes away from the windows as I crawled back in bed, and pulled Ebony close and she finally stayed under the blankets. I snuck a peek at my phone for the time before I laid down, figuring it had to be close to 3 a.m., the witching hour. It was about 2:30. As soon as I laid down, the wind kicked back up and Maria's and Christopher's basset hounds erupted into howls as they came running down to the camper and into the trees. The geese started their noise again. I heard the bassets come back to the camper, barking a few more times before they laid down outside the door to protect me. I didn't get out of bed again that night. I told Maria and Chris what had happened the next morning. I think I was hoping Maria would say she had come down to check on me and Ebony, but she confirmed what I already knew. They had gone to bed as soon as I had left the house. I said a prayer over their house, the camper, and all of us the following night and had an uneventful night, thank God. I also spoke with another guy who's familiar with the supernatural to see if he knew any more about Wendigo. I'm not sure how accurate the information he gave me was, or if it's reliable at all, but when I asked him why Ebony hadn't made a peep, I had assumed it was because she was absolutely petrified. He said a Wendigo can control animals to keep them from alerting their owners about its presence. He also told me 1, they can't enter houses that aren't made of wood directly from the forest they're hunting in, tents and campers included because they consist of man-made materials. 2, a lock is useless, they can unlock and open a door so they can try to lure you outside, and 3, they typically stay in the woods, but they will come into a smaller town, and never into a city. I had never heard of any of what he told me before, so again, I can't speak for accuracy, but I also haven't researched the claims either. He also advised me never to go outside to pee at night if I ever go camping and to bring a bucket or something to use, and to make sure that I always close tent flaps and curtains before falling asleep. He said if the flaps are open so you can see outside, the Wendigo can make eye contact with you and draw you out. After leaving Maria and Christopher's to go to my father's house for a few days, I had the distinct feeling of being watched when I took Ebony outside after dark. My father lived 3 hours away from Maria and Chris, but his house is in the country. I told myself it was only the fear from the experience and what I know about the Wendigo triggering an overactive imagination. I never heard anything, and I watched Ebony's behavior very closely and she didn't act like she had in the camper. I'm moving back to that area from Canada, and this experience has been weighing heavily on my mind. I've been trying to find any information about warding them off, or if they have a home hunting range like cougars do, or if they move on from a region. My prayers did work the second night, so I figure I can pray over the property. I also have holy water that I can use, since the Wendigo is an evil spirit that possesses people or physically manifests. Frustratingly, a majority of what comes up in searches is utter garbage like Wikipedia. Does anyone know if a Wendigo stays in one area? Are my concerns about it coming back when I get moved into my cabin warranted, or am I worrying excessively? Do you have any tips for warding them off? Throughout my youth and in through adulthood, I've had several encounters with entities and energies that are not of this realm, at least not as far as science and history is concerned. These past few years especially, I've had several terrifying experiences being stalked while taking walks late at night around Turner, Maine. Sometimes, I'm overcome with a sense of fear that's animalistic and an innate sense of paranoia consumes me, as if something is watching from the woods and I need to get to safety fast. On other occasions, I've actually had something, quite aggressively follow me alongside me, from the tree line, chasing me away from certain areas, whispering in a low, human-like tone as it moves in the woods alongside me. It sounds like human footsteps crunching across tree branches, leaves, but so much larger, heavier than any human can step. This thing also can hurl itself from treetop to treetop, the power of it so great that it has actually knocked down trees, full goddamn trees as it leaps. I could not make this shit up. It is terrifying to be followed by something that's whispering as it walks in the trees beside you, even when you're running. B can seemingly teleport from one side of the road to the other in seconds. C is so big it can knock down trees as it jumps from top to top. And D, it is so evasive, it can do all of these things while remaining hidden and not perceived by the naked eye. Besides those encounters, I've actually visually seen something I can only relate as a Wendigo. It was either comfortable enough with my energy to reveal itself, or something else altogether. Maybe it wanted to eat me, maybe it wanted to possess me, maybe it wanted to speak to me. I really don't know because I didn't stick around long enough to find out. The energy of this thing, the way it looked, was so offensive, so terrifying, I only remained long enough to visualize what I instinctively knew was coming through the woods and was about to show itself to me. I was frozen while I waited for this thing to come out of the woods. Looking back, I don't know if it was curiosity or the power of the creature itself. I locked eyes with this thing, and when I did, it felt like I was suddenly watching myself from its perspective. As if I was now inside the creature. Horrified, I tore myself away. Luckily I was on the front steps right next to the door, and ran inside with a lit cigarette. I was so scared, I wasn't even thinking any thought besides run. Now, I locked the door, hurried to my bedroom and screamed for my housemate. I refused to even step out of my bedroom for the entire night, and I pulled down the blinds. This particular encounter was so terrifying I was shaking for hours and didn't sleep that night. Some definite details I can remember of this creature was that its face was sunken in and its head was very large in size. Where its eyes should have been, were craters of black, and in the middle, golden, glowing orbs, very, very bright and flame-like. It was on all fours, but this thing can 100% easily walk if it wanted to. The creature was very, very thin. I remember that detail very clear. Its chest was near skeletal and its stomach caved in as if it hadn't eaten in 100 years. Its arms and legs both were very long. Honestly, its arms and legs were the only part of the creature's anatomy that had any mass about it. The creature itself was big. I'm talking like 10 feet tall easy. And if I had to guess, it weighed anywhere between 500 to 600 pounds. It seemingly had fur covering some parts of its body. Along the tops of its arms, back and thighs, but the fur was scarce. Initially, I thought werewolf, but after looking up different cryptids, I can safely say I don't think it was that. Another detail I remember was its mouth. This thing was smiling at me. Its teeth were razor sharp, almost needle-like and long. The size of its smile and the teeth took up most of its face. Where a nose should have been, there were just nostrils, almost like a skull. Its face, actually was very skull-like. The whole body very skeletal. Anyway, I just would really like to talk to somebody who has had similar experiences, or somebody who can relate. This thing, by the way, was not the only cryptid I've encountered or been chased by. The county I live in is very terrifying, old, haunted and linked to some type of portal. All of this is just dust in the wind, and only things I know as fact are from what I personally have witnessed and heard. So many times at night, while walking along the river, I've heard screams so terrifying, so otherworldly, I can only relate it to the cry of a banshee. And yes, I know how all of this sounds. Rest assured, I'm not delusional or any sense of crazy. When I was young, I often spent parts of summers with my grandmother in her home out in the country. It was my favorite place in the world, and I always looked forward to the week-long stays of gardening, baking, late-night fires with s'mores and ghost stories, and enjoying having my grandmother all to myself. There was a pond, not far from her house, where I would sometimes go to swim. It was home to quite a few frogs, and at night they made the most incessant noises. I complained to my grandmother only once, saying I couldn't enjoy the night breeze with all that racket. She took me on her lap and told me a story about an old man and woman who lived near a lake. The old man couldn't stand the singing of the frogs, but his wife told him that they kept the Wendigo away, and to harm them would be unwise. Well, he didn't listen, and set about methodically catching all the frogs on the lake. It was a process that took some time, but he did not stop until he had rid the lake of the pesky amphibians. That night, without the protection of the frogs, he and his wife were slaughtered by the Wendigo, a vicious, whip-like demon creature with elongated fingers ending in razor-sharp talons, and rows of silver teeth as thin and keen as needles. I wrote it off as another of her ghost stories, though she seemed more serious than usual about it. I never complained about the frogs again, mostly because I grew to enjoy them, and put the story out of my mind. In fact, I'd forgotten all about it until it came up this past spring in a Native American literature class I was taking in college. The mention of the Wendigo sparked that old memory of my grandmother's story. I thought she had made up the word. I didn't realize there were stories about it, originating in Algonquian legends. Eager to connect something from my childhood to the topic, I googled it, only to find that my grandmother had apparently been mistaken. There was nothing I could find about the story she had told me, nor any references of frogs providing protection from the Wendigo. In fact, the Wendigo of legend seemed very little like my grandmother's version. They were said to be insatiable, craving human flesh, and sometimes created from the forms of people who had resorted to cannibalism to survive. Descriptions varied, but they sounded almost nothing like my grandmother's bogeyman version. I actually chucked as I read it, almost a bit embarrassed by how badly my grandmother had messed up the original tale. I changed residences this summer, moving to a newly built, 1,000 square foot, on each side, duplex on the edge of town. The other side is to be occupied by my landlady, who'd had the place built. However, she isn't scheduled to move the rest of her stuff in and begin living there for a couple of weeks. She's waiting for her lease to end. Even though my new place is only a few minutes from the edge of town, it feels much more isolated. I enjoy the seclusion of my new home and its proximity to a more natural setting. I'm surrounded by woods, and from my patio, I can even see a pond beyond the carefully landscaped lawn, which is meticulously carved out from the surrounding woodlands. Just like the pond near my grandmother's house, the frogs have put up a ferocious racket lately. I prefer not to pay to run my air conditioning if I can help it, so I have every window open to catch a breeze. That means that I can hear them as clearly as if I were standing on the water's edge. It took a few days to get used to the noise, but I'm fine now, just like I was those summers when I was young. In fact, the noise has been comforting to me during the stress of the move. Tonight is different. I find myself standing in my living room, staring at where the pond is, though I can't see it in the dark. The air is eerily still, and oppressively warm, but all my windows are shut, and I feel impossibly cold. I'd long since convinced myself that my grandmother's story had been a silly tale, a twisting of an old legend by irreverent storytellers. But for some reason, I have the most overwhelming sense of dread growing in the pit of my stomach. I don't know what to do. I'm trapped. Leaving my house means braving the darkness beyond my home, but I don't know if I'm going to be safe in here, either. The frogs have stopped singing. I had an encounter with a Wendigo in northern Idaho. This was a few years ago and I haven't done much research on it until recently. My family and I had gone up to my grandparents' house. They had 10 acres of land and only used about 1 to 1.5 acres for the house and yard. They had a large, dense, pine forest area all around their house. Except for the road to it, there was forest for miles around. They had cut down some trees to make four-wheeler paths that we could ride on when we went up there. One day my sister and I were riding out on the paths on some of my grandparents' four-wheelers. For whatever reason, I think it was to get a drink, but I don't entirely remember, my sister went inside. I thought nothing of it and kept riding the four-wheeler I was on. Well, about 3 minutes later I was driving past a really dense patch of the forest. Over the four-wheeler engine I heard a loud growl. I heard it clearly to my left in the patch of forest. Thinking it was just a coyote, I looked over towards where I heard the growl. I did not see a coyote. You know that feeling when you look into a forest at night and you get scared something will stare back at you? Well, this happened to me in the middle of the day. What I was looking at still haunts me to this day. I was staring into two large, yellow eyes. It appeared that they were sunken into the creature's face. The eyes were probably about 1.75 times the size of a normal human eye, and they were watching me. I could see by looking at the eyes alone that this was a smart creature. I didn't get to see what it was because it was standing in a bush. This bush was very large, like probably about 10 feet tall. About 8 feet up this bush is where I saw these eyes. I couldn't see any other part of this creature, but I didn't stick around to find out what it was. I put the four-wheeler into drive and sped up to about 55 to 60 miles per hour. I ran inside and did not go back out on the paths for the rest of the trip. No one else in my family saw anything, but I was terrified of whatever it was. Fast forward 6 years and it is this year. I was talking with my friend about spooky things we had seen. I told him about this story and began to wonder what I could possibly have seen. I did a lot of research on what large predatory animals live up there. It is northern Idaho if you don't believe me and want to go check. After doing a little bit of digging, I found that no animals that were 8 feet tall. I didn't believe it because I was skeptical of anything that was paranormal. I checked again and again because I didn't want to believe it was something that no one had ever captured or been able to prove existed. The largest wolf ever found would have only been 6 feet tall when standing on its hind legs. The largest bear might have been large enough, but it could not have fit in that bush, so I began to research any possible creature that it could have been. Eventually I found one. A Wendigo. It was the only possible creature I could have seen. I don't know why it didn't attack me, or why it let me get away. Based off the features I saw, the large, yellow, sunken eyes, it could have only been a Wendigo. What scared me even more, is that a couple years later my grandparents moved out of that house for an unknown reason. They say it was to be closer to the family, but the family was fine making a long drive, and coming up very often. They moved only a little bit closer. It is still a long drive. It happened while I was at a local summer camp. There was absolutely nothing special about that day, no weird lights, people, animals, sounds, nothing. It was just the same camp schedule as I'd grown used to in the past 2 weeks I'd been there. My age group had just finished lunch and was able to persuade our counselor to let us play a game called Scatter down by the lake. It's like a giant hide and seek in the woods. Now we had played this at least 20 times before the day and nothing weird had happened to any of us, and we all grew up playing in the woods, so it's not like we had an aversion or fear of it, but for some reason that day when our counselor shouted scatter, and I ran to find a hiding place, it became a whole new ballgame. I had run as far as I could while still being able to see the lake, as were the rules, and had found a huge old uprooted tree that I decided would be the perfect hiding place. So I laid down as close as I could against the ground and waited. I had been there for about 5 minutes when I suddenly heard a voice calling my name in a weird dreamy-like voice, and not just any voice, it was my mom's. Now me and my mom are extremely close, thick as thieves, so I'd know her voice anywhere, and I would swear on my own grave that it was without a doubt hers. But I knew it couldn't be her. She was 20 miles away at work, and even if it had actually been her and she'd come to pick me up early, the voice wasn't coming from the lake, it was coming from further out in the woods beyond the border of the camp. I knew I should have run away from this strange mimic mom voice, but I couldn't. It was almost hypnotic. It messed with my thoughts and gave me doubts like, well, it could be mom. Or what if she's hurt? And I have to get to her. All these things were flooding into my mind like someone had broken a dam I didn't know was there, until they finally overwhelmed me and emotions got the better of me, and I took off running in the direction the voice was coming from. I ran as far as I could with only this strange voice as my guide. I couldn't have run for more than 5 or 7 minutes when I got to a clearing and the voice suddenly stopped. When I entered the clearing and didn't hear my mom's voice calling me anymore, I could finally think clearly again. I started to have little alarm bells go off inside my head saying, "You idiot," or "That's not mom," and run. But I couldn't run. I didn't know where to run. I had gotten so far away I had lost sight of the lake by camp and had absolutely no idea where I was, and I was completely exhausted to boot. With no other options than to sit and catch my breath, I did just that. No sooner had I sat down, more warning bells went off in my head. I quickly did a 360 survey around the clearing and noticed a strange noise. It wasn't the continuation of the voice before. This time it was the distinct sound of chattering teeth, like if you were cold, only there was no one else around and it was the middle of June in North Carolina. There's no way someone could be cold. And that's when I heard it. Leaves and sticks crunch on the edge of the small clearing, and I realized something was watching me. Whatever it was, it moved fast in circles around the clearing, almost like it was circling prey, and it was at that moment I knew whatever it was had led me out there away from the rest of my group, exactly like the predator my instincts had been screaming at me that it was. Without any other option other than to try and escape, I took off in the direction I thought I came from and sprinted as fast as I could, while hearing the chittering of teeth and sticks crunching behind me. I didn't know what to do, and I didn't dare turn around see what was chasing me. It felt like a lifetime running away from this thing before I finally saw the lake. At that point I felt safe enough to stop and look back and see just what had been chasing me. But when I did, I only saw a fleeting form running back the way I had come and the distant sounds of chittering teeth. When I finally found my counselor, who was the seeker to find all of us, I was hysterical with fear and hugged her as tight as I could. When I finally calmed down, she tried to get me to tell her what happened, but I just asked, "Were you calling my name?" Before she even said anything, I already knew the answer. After all, it had been my mom's voice that led me away from everyone else, but what she said replied with was so much more bone-chilling to me. She told me, "No one called for you. We didn't know you were gone. Everyone is still hiding. The game isn't over yet." As we come to the end of our journey into the world of the Wendigo, we hope you've been captivated by the mysterious and terrifying stories of this creature. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the unknown. Remember to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling stories and chilling mysteries from around the world. Leave us a comment about your thoughts on this video and don't hesitate to share it with your friends who are fans of the supernatural. Until next time, keep an open mind and stay tuned for our next episode of Threads of Truth. The truth is out there, and we will find it. Thanks for watching.